In a minute, we will welcome on stage Mr. Andrew FERRONE. Andrew, the head of the Meteorological Department of the Technical Agricultural Service Administration and president of Luxembourg Observatoire des Politiques Climatiques. He will tell us more about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, short for IPCC. The IPCC is the leading international body of the scientific assessment of climate change. Please welcome Andrew with a big round of applause.
Prime Minister, Madam Minister, ladies and gentlemen, dear young scientists. So I was asked today, let me just check if this is work. Yes. So I was asked today to show you how you can actually contribute to solve the problem of climate change. We heard the topic already addressed several times today in the speeches we heard, and I would like to show you a possibility how you as scientists can actually contribute to solving this problem. So some of you may have already participated in the climate strikes that were also held here in Luxembourg by Youth for Climate. And of course, those are claiming that we see the impacts of climate change also here in Luxembourg. Sorry for that. That the problems of climate change are also happening here in Luxembourg and that they are caused by the greenhouse gases emitted by humans. But on the other side, we also have the politicians who need to take actions, who need to take decisions that need to be taken to solve the problem and to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions so that climate change is not being further accelerated. And that's why in 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, short for IPCC, has been created by the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations program. Its objective is to deliver scientific-based and neutral information to governments at all levels and so that they can use this scientific information to solve the problem of climate change. So how does the IPCC work? On the one side, we have the panel itself, which is composed by representatives of governments, which you see here in our last physical session in Paris in 2020, at the very beginning of 2020. And on the other side, you have the authors, the scientists of the IPCC. And actually, they are in a dialogue with each other. So the authors, they are writing reports, and then the governments are there to analyze these reports and in the dialogue with the authors to write it in a way that it can be used actually by policymakers and that can be understood by policymakers. So who exactly are the IPCC authors? Actually, they come from very many backgrounds. Climate science is, of course, the most clear background that you can have, but there are very many backgrounds. Today we have scientists from all natural sciences participating in the IPCC. We have the social scientists participating in the IPCC. We even have lawyers today participating as authors to the IPCC, because we also need to analyze actually what the governments are writing in the decisions that they are making. Of course, when selecting the authors for the IPCC, gender plays a role, the scientific background and the experience plays a role. But actually, there are thousands of scientists from the IPCC. Let me just highlight 3 of them. Here is Mustafa Tal, who is from Senegal, and he is actually interested in the impacts of climate change on the monsoon. So he's looking at the very regional impacts of climate change. There is Veronika Eyring from Germany. She's looking at the modelization of climate change at a global level, but also the impacts that it has, and she has a physical background. And there is Lucas Ruiz from Argentina, and he's actually somebody who is really working on the field as a glaciologist, going to glaciers in South America, but also in other parts of the world, and analyzing how they react to climate change. These are just 3 examples of rather young scientists that have participated to the latest IPCC report. But there were also scientists who are much more senior and who participated actually in the first to the third assessment report of the IPCC. And this was Sioko Manabe and Klaus Hasselmann, who last year actually both got the Physics Nobel Prize for their work on modeling of climate change and also the attribution of climate change to human activities. So that was an enormous recognition of their work as a physicist who they contributed, amongst others, of course, to the IPCC. So how do they work exactly? First of all, the scientists, they focus, of course, on their specific topic of research, but for the IPCC, they do not conduct own research. Actually, what they are doing, they go to the scientific literature, read it very carefully, and then put it together into the reports of the IPCC. So the IPCC doesn't do their own reports, but really they summarize the scientific research that is published in the peer-review literature. And what is important to understand is that all these scientists are contributing this during their free time, actually, because they are contributing this on a voluntary basis. So they are completely voluntary, and it's an enormous effort of what they are actually doing. So how does an IPCC report look like? Actually, we are at the moment publishing the latest report, the 6th assessment report. And here you see on the, so we have 3 working groups, one about the physical science basics, which has been published in August last year. Then we have one on adaptation and vulnerability. It has been published approximately 3 weeks ago. And we have the working group 3 on mitigation, where the plenary for approval, the report will start actually tomorrow and will last for 2 days in full virtual format. And the report will be published on the 4th of April. So you can also look forward to that one. The report itself, the scientific report, is between 3,000 to 4,000 pages long. So I'm very honest, I have never read the entirety of it, and I'm sure the policymakers in the room don't have the time to read it themselves. That's why first we do a technical summary. This is actually meant for the scientists so that they get an overview of the topic. And then we have the summary for policymakers, which is approved line by line. So this one is then in the plenary approved line by line. My slide skipped, I can't go back, but actually above it there is also the synthesis report, where we synthesize the work of the 3 working groups. And this one will be published in September of this year for the 6th assessment report. And there, for example, the distinction between mitigation and adaptation can be fully addressed only, which cannot be done in the working groups. So how does an approval of a report work in detail? First of all, there is a scoping meeting where scientists say, okay, these are the challenges that actually we would like to address. This is the topic that we would like to address. This approval is approved by the panel. So by the governments, they approve the panel, they look at it, they make detailed changes to it to be clear that they understand really what the scientists actually want to do. Based on this, the Bureau of the IPCC nominates the authors, which are first nominated by governments, and then the Bureau actually makes a selection of them. Once they have been selected, they make a first draft of the report. So this is the full report without the summary for policymakers yet. This one is sent only out to experts for review. So actually everybody with, I would say, a bachelor degree can register as an expert to the IPCC. This is open to basically everybody who is in a field of science related to the IPCC, which is, as I said, very broad. And then they can give comments to the reports. Each of these comments has to be addressed by the authors, and they get really thousands of them. I have some figures later on, but there are thousands of them, and they have to address it. Then they rewrite basically the whole report for the second one, and they write the first draft of the summary for policymakers. Then the whole report and the summary for policymakers is sent back to experts. That's the same as in the first round, can also be a different one, and for the first time also to governments. Again, they receive thousands of comments on this one, and then they produce the final report. and also a new draft for the summary for policymakers, which is sent out once more to the governments, this time only to the governments. And then they have to, after they receive the comments, they have to rewrite it. And then the summary for policymakers goes into the plenary. So for Working Group 3, that's what's happening now over the next 2 weeks. And there we go through it line by line, sentence by sentence, and each sentence has to be approved by consensus by the government representatives and the authors. But it's important to understand that the authors always have the last word. So everything is scientifically 100% correct, we are sure about that. But of course, as I said previously, the governments are there that actually it's written in a form that it can be used by policymakers. And after this approval, where we approve the summary for policymakers and accept the whole report, it is published to the general public. So some numbers just to give you some idea of how this works. For the most recent Working Group 2 contribution to the IPCC, there were in total 270 authors who have actually written the report. There were 675 contributing authors who contributed just some parts of it to the reports. The 270 authors, they came from 67 countries. 40% of them were women, so we have not yet reached parity, but it's the highest participation in women in the working group that we had so far. They assessed more than 43,000 scientific papers, so you can imagine the breadth they had. And they received over 62,000 review comments, to which they had to reply one by one. So they really had to explain for each one what they changed, and if they didn't change anything, why they rejected it. And all this, even the comments, you can now find online. You can go and look yourself. You can see which comments Luxembourg provided and how they reacted to it. So that's the way the IPCC is working. In order to know if it had actually an impact on policymakers, I would like to have this quote from one of the co-chairs of Working Group 1, Valérie Masson-Delmotte, who said at the COP26 that this report is a reality check. We have a much clearer picture of the past, present, and future climate, which is essential for understanding where we are headed, what can be done, and how we can prepare to climate change. Otherwise, on the history of the IPCC, did it have an impact? My answer to this is clearly yes. First of all, as I said previously, the IPCC was founded in 1988. It was only 2 years later that actually the framework that is being used today to discuss about climate change on a political level, the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was founded. So it was after the IPCC, and it was based on the first report of the IPCC. Then afterwards, under the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to, which you certainly have all heard of, and this was actually strongly based on the second report of the IPCC. Then in 2001, there was a discussion about how to adapt to climate change, because we know even if we can limit climate change to 1.5 degrees, there are consequences of it. We see them here in Luxembourg, but we also see them worldwide. And there was a discussion, how can this adaptation be done? And this came from the third report of the IPCC. The fourth report of the IPCC was the first which clearly highlighted the 2 degrees target, that above 2 degrees there are really consequences of climate change which are not controllable anymore. And this then got also a discussion which, after the release of the fifth assessment report, which was even more stringent on the temperature limit, led to the Paris Agreement with the goal of limiting to 2 degrees with efforts to pursue towards going to 1.5 degrees. So the goal was even more stringent. And this was clearly based on the fifth assessment report. And at the Paris Agreement, it was also agreed that each 5 years, all the countries of the world come together, assess their progress towards the goals of the Paris Agreement, and then see how to build up more ambition. That's the so-called global stocktake. And actually, the global stocktake is going on now. It has started, but it will only finalize in 2023, so 1 year time. So actually, the present report, the sixth assessment report, has been or will be a major input into the global stocktake that is happening right now. So just two examples of where we really had an impact, where the IPCC really had an impact. The first is, of course, the one I mentioned already in the Paris Agreement with the Article 2 target of holding increase of global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. But also, and it was mentioned already today in the speeches at COP26, where actually in the political declaration of the COP, there was a whole chapter dedicated to science and urgency, where of course the contribution of the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC was welcomed, but also the urgency was stressed, and how we have to react to it in the following decisions. And for example, one of them was that that there is indeed a goal to or an effort to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 45% compared to 2010 in 2030, and this comes directly from the IPCC report. So now, to you young scientists, how can you actually get involved? Well, first, of course, pursue your career in science, do your studies in the field of science that you are most interested in and that you are most, you feel most comfortable in. Because, as I said previously, the subject is not so important. You can contribute to solving this challenge with nearly all the subjects today. Of course, I encourage you to read the IPCC report, and as I said, you can already get involved as an expert reviewer once you have reached your bachelor degree. Or you can also get in touch with your national focal point of the IPCC, because many of the scientists of the IPCC who are there today first were a member of the national delegation, so that's how they got into the IPCC, and then later on only they became an author of the IPCC. And the last message I would like to give here is that, especially to the young female scientists that we have today, that they should really pursue their career, because as you see here at the first assessment report, we only had 8% of women. Working Group 1 didn't have a single woman who participated. Today we are 33% in total for the sixth assessment report, so at least a third percent of women, but we are doing efforts in the IPCC to bring this to 50%. But of course, in order to do this, we need young scientists, young female scientists with excellence. And with this, I would like to close my talk and thank you for your attention.